Welcome to another edition of What's on the Horizon. I'm Lori Sharonbrock, and I am here today with Chris Schucker of Digital Horizons. And today we're going to talk about TVs, specifically LCD versus OLED TVs. So I was at Costco recently, and you walk in that front door and like immediately bombarded by so many screens. And I imagine like any homeowner, it is super overwhelming to even begin to start to choose what you're looking at. So can you talk first a little bit about what the differences are between like an LCD and an OLED to even begin to have a reasonable discussion about that?
Yeah. So LCD and OLED are the two primary display technologies that exist now. 90 to 95% of the televisions that you see anywhere from any manufacturer are just an LCD display. Sometimes you'll hear LED thrown around a lot, not OLED, just LED on its own. And some manufacturers have gone so far as to call their televisions LED TVs, but it's really not the case. There's still a liquid crystal display based screen, and they're using LEDs, the light, as the light source behind the front LCD panel. And the front LCD panel is what provides the image, the color, and the motion, and then the LED backlight lights it up. So when you're looking at televisions, again, 90 to 95% of them are an LCD screen. And the drawback with an LCD display is the backlight. The backlight is the drawback. And the reason it's the drawback is when you have a backlight involved in any display technology, because there's other display technologies in projectors and other technologies. When you have a backlight involved, you can't create black. People say the color black. Black's not a color, but it's easier just to refer to that. So when you have a backlight involved, you can't create the color black because black is the absence of light. And so if you were to turn the backlight off where the LCD screen is, you can create black, but you can't do that on a pixel by pixel basis, right? So on all of these new televisions, they have 8 million, 4 million, just lots and lots of millions of pixels. And the backlight can't be turned off on a discrete enough level to where it matters. And so what ends up happening is part of your image kind of gets washed out a little bit. And so black ends up being more gray. And that's where OLED, which is an emergent technology, Sony's on their, I believe, 5th generation of OLED TVs now. The reason OLED is vastly superior in almost every scenario compared to an LCD screen is there is no backlight. So the image is actually controlled on a pixel by pixel basis. So if they want it, let's say they're shooting some San Francisco scene and they're on the boardwalk, right? And the camera is looking at somebody standing underneath a lamp and it's 10 o'clock at night and it's dark. That point which the light stops and where the darkness is, because the image is being controlled on a pixel by pixel basis, they can actually turn off the pixels that need to be black and leave the ones on that need to be white or whatever color is being created. And you get that dynamic range of black to whatever color you need to create. And that's why it's just vastly superior. That alone makes it superior to LCD screens. OLED has what's referred to as a wider color space, which is a technical way of saying it produces more colors. And it's just those two things together, just having pixel by pixel control, being able to create black and full brightness, and having a more dynamic color space. It's not even comparable if you have an OLED television next to it. Even some of the best LCD screens, like the best LCDs from Sony and Sony's best OLEDs, it might be a little hyperbolic to say it's night and day, but it's pretty close to that. So The only limiting factor to OLED now, until this year, mostly, has been size. So when they first came out, it was basically 55 and 65 was the only option for the first couple of years. Then they introduced a 77-inch, but it was really expensive. Like we're talking $10,000 or $15,000, really, really expensive. And now this year they have 48, sorry, 55, 65, 77, 83. So there's now, you have the size ranges. And then the last obstacle, which is price, the price is coming down too. The 83-inch, albeit still very expensive, but comparatively at $7,000 is a lot less than it had been in previous years. So it's really only drawback is it consumes more power now and is a little less bright compared to LCD, but it's almost negligible. So it's really just a power thing, and everything else aside from cost is vastly superior. I don't normally get excited about display technologies. That's not my jam. I'm very passionate about audio, but I'm passionate about OLED. If anybody remembers back to, do you remember plasma TVs?
Oh yeah, yep.
So plasma TVs for almost all instances were better than LCD televisions. They had better refresh rates, they had better color. Again, the image was controlled on a pixel by pixel basis, so you could create black, and it was almost better in every aspect except for a glare and a glare reason. But there was some really bad myths that floated around about plasma that kept people from buying it. And LCD just won out from customer sentiment that was mostly inaccurate. Plasma was really treated very poorly for what it was capable of. There's plasmas now that were made 7 or 8 years ago that'll stand up against the best LCDs of today outside of resolution, you know? So OLED is that dynamic, actual change in shift in display technology that is very, very, very drastic and very worth it.
And is Sony the player in OLED, or is there anybody else who does them, or is it just like, no, they're who you do it with?
LG and Sony are the two main manufacturers for OLED, and Sony is, and we're a Sony dealer. That's who we work with. That's who we've partnered with. So I feel fortunate that I can confidently say that they are objectively the better manufacturer right now. That's not always the case, but for now and at least the last 3 or 4 years, they've definitely had the best display when it comes to OLED. You could argue the value proposition maybe isn't as good, but if we're trying to be objective on who has the best TV, it's absolutely Sony right now.
And you kind of mentioned earlier the differences in the sizes, and that size originally was kind of the limiting factor. Is there a recommended size that you should go with? Like, hey, the 55 is great, or nope, you should do the 83.
There really isn't a wrong size, but there are obviously certain instances where it can be too big. For example, like a bedroom, if you have if you're 14 feet away from your bedroom, you don't want a 55-inch TV in there. You know, a 43 or 49 is very, very adequate. But if we're talking like a dedicated TV viewing room where you're going to sit down and watch sporting events, you're going to do gaming, you're going to watch movies, you're going to binge Netflix, whatever, size there's no limit. I mean, with the resolution of content and these TVs, you literally can't go too big if you have a dedicated room for it and it fits. Like, obviously it has to fit. If your wall doesn't support it, then it's too big, obviously. Right. But you can comfortably sit 10 feet away from an 85-inch TV, and there's so much detail that the human eye can't resolve enough to make it look for the image to be distracting. Early on with high definition displays, if you remember when HD first came out and the highest resolution was 1280 by 720, yeah, and there was 1 million pixels, you could sit too close to that because you could see the lines. But when you compare a 50-inch that has a resolution of 1280 by 720, which is 1,000,000 pixels or just under, to a 50-inch now that is 4K, that's 8,000,000 pixels. There's 8 times as many pixels in that same amount of space, and the eye can't resolve it. So it actually goes the other way in that sometimes it's unnecessary to have a super high resolution if you aren't going a certain size TV. Because if you're gonna sit 10 feet away from a 32-inch TV, there's no point in spending what could be twice as much for a 4K television because your eye literally can't see it.
Can't tell the difference.
So size matters more on if you're going really small and sitting too far away more than it does going too big and sitting too close.
Is there ever a case where an LCD is better, or is it if you're gonna spend the money, do the OLED?
The only real example that I would recommend an LCD screen over an OLED is if it's a really, really bright room and you intend on watching the TV during that peak brightness. So if you have a home with bay windows and you want to sit down and catch, I don't even know who the daytime drama shows are, but there you go. If you're going to sit down in the afternoon and it's really bright and you want to watch that, that's probably the only environment that I would recommend an LCD over an OLED. But if you had an OLED there, it's not going to be unwatchable and it would be just fine. But that, if we're getting critical, that's the one space. But outside of that, everything is on the favor of OLED.
Well, that is really super helpful information because I know that shopping for that kind of stuff can be really overwhelming, looking at the different brands and the different sizes. But at least if you know, like, no, this is the best, this is the brand, start there. And then, like you said, work on size depending on your room and your use, right?
There's one thing that I'll add, and this is a really hard thing to quantify, but if you go into big box stores, especially Costco's great, it has its place. You're not seeing the television in an environment that you can actually critically evaluate its performance. It's just not possible. You have three major things that are working against you. Number one, they've curated that content to be bright and vibrant, and they're not showing off where a display is, where its performance is where it's a make or break situation. And that's when you need to view it, when it's showing dark content, lots of contrast. They don't show that. The content is, carnivals and,
NFL
underwater sea life. And,
totally.
you can't understand the TV's capabilities when you view that content. Number two, they're set up to oversaturate all colors, all brightness, everything's cranked up. And that's not an accurate representation of what the TV is capable of. And then third, you're watching it with 500, 300 watt bulbs beaming down on you, washing out everything around you, flooding your irises, opening, forcing your eyes to constrict down. And it's like everything. And I say this understanding that most people aren't going to be able to be critical and know what to look for, but I know why it's done. They're there to sell products, and that's, they have to. It's a race that they have to run. There's no other way to do it, because if they set the televisions up to show critical content in a bright, harsh environment like that, they probably wouldn't look good. People would be like, God, that TV looks terrible. Why would I want to buy that? But when you take it home and you have more subdued lighting and you're watching more realistic content, and the TV needs to be set up to accurately recreate that content. And then the last thing that I'll say is, especially Costco, but then also Target and Walmart, they don't carry the full line of products from these manufacturers. They carry the lower end items.
Oh, yeah.
You can't even get OLED TVs that are Sony in Costco. I think I saw a couple LG models there, but they're they're making specific products to be sold or to be marketed to the warehouse stores. And they're fine televisions. They have features that, you know, meet most people's needs, but they're made to a price point to what Costco thinks that they can sell to, because they do sell a ton of stuff. So it's just something to be mindful of.
What would be the ideal shopping experience or research experience? Like how should that process look?
That's hard because your average consumer can't do that.
Yeah.
You know, it takes, I mean, I don't want to say it takes a hobbyist's perspective, but it's such a complicated thing that they create the marketing jargon and the display setups to give people the full sense of I'm failing for the word here, but they want to make people feel like they know what they're looking at, but they don't. But they don't. There's no other way to do it. It's like when you're selling a car, most people don't know what horsepower actually means, or
Right.
what torque is, or all of these other things. So they create things people can relate to. Agency. They want to give people agency over their decisions. So they create an environment that they think they can make a decision on. And not that people make a wrong decision when they buy a television in those environments, far from it. But if you're being critical or trying to fully understand it, it's those environments aren't adequate to properly understand a TV's capability.
And I think that's
And
why
I'm being, you know, very, very critical of the situation. But I mean, it's, you know, we fill that niche, and that's what we have to do, you know.
But I think that's why it's great having access to someone like you, and that any homeowner can do that. If I wanted advice about a TV, you know, ideally, right, you and I would sit down and have a conversation, and you would have access to something like that. I mean, is that something that any homeowner can do with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't have to be that, oh, I'm building a brand new house and I want a TV. Like, we literally can just have a discussion about TVs with you.
The quantity of projects that we do, or what we refer to as installs, are really basic. Just delivering and installing TVs, basic sound systems, very, very what we refer to as simple, everyday type things. Like, that's the majority of what we do. We get a lot of credit and accolades and attention for the fancy stuff, and but on the day to day, we're doing, you know, the everyday stuff, like providing televisions and installing them and hiding wires and making things look neat and clean, and making sure the work we do doesn't damage the house. And you know, the stuff that's a given is our everyday operations.
So how could we start? How could a homeowner reach out to you and get started?
You could call us. Our number is 218-330-4140. Or I'm sure down below this video or somewhere we'll have a link to our website where we've got examples of our work. We have an awesome, people call it a showroom. I hate that term. We call it our experience center, and people can come in here and actually see the technology that we have. We always have a really nice TV in our living room area. We have a Samsung frame TV up on the wall so people can see what that looks like. And then we have a smaller one that pops out of a cabinet in a drop down lift. And it's just real world examples, environments, and you can see, touch, and feel everything.
Yeah, I think that I like that, what you say about that, because you can control that lighting in there to be realistic to what it is like in your living room, and say, this is what it will look like for you, versus, like you said, being under the glare of a Best Buy light. You know, you can actually see what it looks like in a home space.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, that is such amazing information, and really illuminating, for lack of a better word, on what it means to do that. Because I think a purchase of a TV, like, that's a major thing for homeowners. It's and if you're going to spend that kind of money, you should do it right so that it will last you a long time too.
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. That's just really great information, and we'll see you in the next video.
See ya.